Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is ScottyD49, and once again, I am back with you for another installment in If You Are New to the Hobby series. And today, we're going to be talking about what are the worst 5 things to do when you are first painting Warhammer 40K miniatures, and why. So this is really going to be focused around painting. What to do, what not to do, and really give you those core foundational basics about what you should be doing and why by telling you what you shouldn't be doing. So let's get straight into it. Number 1, painting without undercoating a miniature. Now, you'll see I've got this guy right here. This is a Blade Guard Ancient from the Indominus box, and you can see he's actually quite stark plastic. The reason why you want to always undercoat your miniatures is that because we paint with water-based acrylic paints, if it doesn't actually have a surface that it adheres to really well, what will actually happen is that over time, with wear and tear, and you picking up the models and putting them in the case and pulling them out to put on the battlefield and rinse, repeat that process over time, what you'll actually do is you'll rub off the paint and you'll see grey plastic. And what you'll need to end up doing is go back, reapply the paint, redo your washes, redo your highlights, time and time again, because you didn't spend that half an hour doing that undercoat first. Now, the quickest way to do your undercoat is with spray paint. Now, you can do it by brush, but more often than not, companies like Games Workshop, like Army Painter, have got undercoat that you're able to use. So you can either go with, and I've got a couple of miniatures examples, that's why I'm looking away from the camera. You've got a black undercoat, which you can see I've got a Terminator done up in black. He's got a Stormbolter and Power Sword as a sergeant for a unit, and he's spray painted in black. Or nowadays, Games Workshop has got several color-based undercoats you can use, as does Army Painter. Army Painter's got a lot more variety than Games Workshop, of course. But you can see I've got a Necron Warrior here, and this guy is undercoating Lead Belcher. The Lead Belcher spray from Games Workshop. Now, more often than not, these companies will have these spray paints based off a color that they have in their normal range. So, and it's going to be pretty close to it. So if you make mistakes, what you can then do is go back, fix it up during your painting without too much color change, with it being very close, if not bang on. Number 2, using a larger brush than you need. Now, many people will start out and buy a brush set, and you may get a couple of different brushes where it's a base coating brush, you'll get a detail brush, you may get a wash brush or a dry brush. They're kind of your standard ones, but as you acquire more brushes or you're working with what you've got, you really want to use smaller brushes than what you think. By using a larger brush, if you are doing so, what you're actually going to do if you're working on a detailed piece of the model is a couple of things. 1, you're actually going to put more paint on that area than you need, and that'll result in you losing that detail that you're working on. 2, you'll get paint on areas that you don't actually want it to be on. Now, if this is after your base coat and after you've cleaned up, that means you have to go back, you then have to clean up for a second time. You're then wasting time where you could get further progress done on the miniature. So instead of doing that, by using a smaller brush, now some people have a standard size brush they'll recommend, like, oh, you've got a base coating brush, detail brush, fine detail, insane if you're using Army Painter. Games Workshop, I know, just do the detail, fine detail. If you're using a larger brush, I always will recommend using one size smaller. Now, I'm not saying this to go, oh, you have to pick a fine detail brush to paint out all your base coating when it comes to doing a Space Marine or doing a Drakari Witch. What I'm saying is pick a smaller brush. Now, I will often paint my models, and I've got one here, with a character brush from Army Painter. The reason why I choose to paint with this brush is because it's smaller, the tip's a lot easier to control, and I have a lot less paint on the brush to start with, which means I'm not getting as much paint on those detail areas where I'm going to end up losing detail. I'm able to control the brush a lot easier, and I'm also not going to get paint on spots where I don't want it to be. Number 3, having too much paint on your brush. This kind of leads on from our second point, but I wanted to cover this one in a bit more detail because even with a smaller brush, you can still have too much paint on that brush. So what you end up doing is that you end up actually damaging your brushes, and it's not necessarily the metal part. It's going to be the bristles, really, is what you're going to damage. So if you've got too much paint on there and you're painting a large surface area over time, what that'll do, the paint will cake on there, means you've got to wash out your brush and then get more paint on there to keep on going. However, if you have too much paint to the point where on a brush it actually comes up to the metal, that's really bad, because what it'll actually do is, this is called the ferrule, it'll actually go behind and in through the ferrule, and it'll actually dry on the bristles there and make them actually quite brittle. It'll actually mean that they will taper off and away from that center point that you're wanting to keep, and over time they will also break off, which means that you will have to purchase more brushes more frequently, rather than if you look after them and make sure that you don't put too much paint on them, you're going to have to buy them infrequently. Now, the character brush that I use, as you can see, is quite well used. But the reason why it's still got a good point and I'm able to control it as well as I do is because I look after it. So the biggest thing here is to don't put a lot of paint on your brush. Make sure it's watered down always. But also only put as much paint on there as you need and halfway up those bristles. So when I paint with the character brush, I'm only generally putting paint up to about there. I'm not putting it any further up. Now, some paints like washes are designed to kind of fill in that brush space, and brushes will absorb that very easily. So that is one that unfortunately not going to be able to avoid. But with your standard paints, you are going to be able to control how much is on the brush by just making sure that there's only the amount you need. Number 4, painting directly out of a paint pot. There are several issues that arise when you're consistently painting directly from a paint pot. Now, there's often times on stream where I will literally crack open a paint pot, having a wet brush, grab a little bit of what I need, and go and finish off a final spot, because that is literally all the paint that I need. I will then wash the brush, make sure the pot's closed after I've gotten the paint out, I'm done. But if you're consistently pulling paint and using that paint pot to get your paint from, there are several big issues that you could run into. Number 1, you're actually less able to control how much of the paint is on that brush. You'll actually have more on there than you really need. Number 2 is it actually leaves the paint pot open to being knocked over, to being spilt everywhere, whether that's on your desk, your cutting mat. If you're painting on your kitchen table, it'll get spilt on there if you're not careful. On your clothes, we'll get into that in a second. On the floor, all those kind of spaces. But it'll also mean you then have to try and clean that up, and then you may only have a quarter of a pot left if you're lucky. So then you've got to go and you've got to buy more of that paint. The third one is that if you leave it open consistently, what'll end up happening, if it's not a wash or a glaze or something along those lines, more often than not, your standard paints will start to dry because of that air exposure. So what you want to do instead is that you want to get a painting palette. Now, I know I spoke previously in the worst tools to use. In terms of painting, you want a paint palette. At this point, something is better than nothing. Whether it's a plastic plate, whether it's one of those throwaway plastic paint palettes, whether it's a tile you're able to get. You could even get a sample tile from, say, Bunnings or your local hardware store. Whatever you get, at least so that you're able to put paint down out of the pot. You can then close the pot. You're controlling a lot better how much paint's on your brush, but also it means you're not risking being able to spill that paint all over your working area, on your clothes, on yourself, and on the floor. As well, it means the paint pot's going to dry out a lot slower. Now, of course, it will dry out over time. That's just the way things are. However, you're actually able to preserve the paint a lot better by not consistently painting out of the pot. And number 5, Holding onto the base of a miniature that you are painting. Now, this one is absolutely fraught with danger, and I see it all too often. People will hold a miniature by the base, they'll grab their brush and they're painting away, and oops, they drop it. Because the miniature is so small, you're not going to be able to grip it really well. So you're not going to be able to have a stable hold. It'll also mean that if you do drop it, you risk damaging the model, getting paint on your clothes and on yourself. Now, water-based acrylic paints, surprisingly enough, don't come out of clothes really easily. It takes a heck of a lot, and depending on the color, you may never get it out. And then it could get on the floor. If you've got carpet, it'll stain. All these different things, like it, even when you drop it. But also, by holding it with the base, if you're painting down near your hand, and then you move on to the next part and you suddenly put your thumb on the foot and it's still wet, you can then smudge the paint, which means you have to go back, you have to redo that coat, you have to touch it up, and that's time wasted away from actually doing more work on the miniature to progress your projects further. By actually getting something to secure your models to, whether that's an old paint pot with blue tack on like you see on my streams like I do, or whether that's, we had a member of our community actually cut out some small timber blocks and actually sand them up, make sure they were nice and easy to hold, and adhere models to that. Or whether that's a GW painting handle if you're up to that point of wanting to get those, or whether it's a wine bottle cork, I should say, and you're affixing your models to that. At least something is better than nothing, because what that'll mean is you've got a solid grip on the model. You're not holding it with your fingertips, so you've actually got a solid grip, so it's a lot more stable to paint with. It also means you're less likely to smudge the paint that you are putting onto the model, because your hand and your fingers are nowhere near the model itself. And it also means that you're less likely to drop it. Now, of course, if you do get distracted or lose your grip, there is that potential to drop the miniature. There's always a risk of that. However, having something to hold onto dramatically reduces that risk. Alright everyone, I hope you enjoyed those what are the worst 5 things to do when first painting Warhammer 40k miniatures and why, and you really are able to take away some good pointers on how to actually improve your painting and why you should do specific things, like, you know, making sure that you're undercoating your miniatures, making sure you're not painting with too much paint on your brush, that you are painting with a smaller brush than you think you need, or an appropriate sized brush, that you're not painting directly out of the pot, that you're controlling the amount of paint that you've got on a palette, and you're also not holding the miniature with the base, because all of those things have fraught dangers and will take time away from progressing through an army, through getting it there. I do stream over on Twitch. I stream Tuesday nights, Friday nights, and Saturdays during the day, with a mixture of hobbying content as well as live 40k games as well. You can catch me at twitch.tv/ScottyD49. All the schedule and information is down below, as well as the rest of my socials. If you do enjoy the video, feel free to leave a comment. If you do disagree with anything that I've said, feel free to share your thoughts. Feel free to drop a like and share this with a friend as well, that you think will use this information and help them grow in the hobby. But for now, I've been ScottyD49, and I'll catch you in the next video.